somewhere in the dusky stillness of a Victorian house, as chimney smoke curls lazily into the milk glass sky. One could hear it, the low, dignified clang of a bell. Precisely 5:30 a.m. It's not yet proper morning, but merely suspiciously late night. And this, dear dreamer, is when the servant's day dutifully begins. In the great synchronized ballet of domestic life, the first dancer to take the stage was often the under-housemaid, possibly the most tragically awake person in London. She'd rise from her narrow cot in the attic, where the walls sighed with draughts and the occasional mouse-deployed reconnaissance missions underfoot. No alarm clock needed. The servants' internal clocks were as precise and less bearable than Westminster's famed bell. Her first task, lighting over a dozen fireplaces without setting anyone or anything ablaze. Armed with a coal scuttle and a dangerously hopeful attitude, she tiptoed across silent corridors like a soot-dusted ghost. Each room demanded a fire, and each fireplace, in summer or winter, replied with a polite but obstinate refusal to behave. Flints were flinty, hearths were ungrateful. The morning was long before it was warm. Meanwhile, the scullery maid, whom Dickens once described lightly as most everything short of furniture, had already begun her timeless battle with the previous day's dishes. The scullery was the kitchen's kitchen, or more accurately, the realm beneath the kitchen, where dampness and soap never parted ways. Washing crockery in icy water before the rest of the house even dreamed of tea was a time-honored ritual, though not one anyone ever volunteered for. Then there was the cook, the grand matriarch of the downstairs kingdom. She'd rise early, yes, but only slightly earlier than judgment demanded. Clad in flannel and resolve, she would arrive in the kitchen as the first eggs were set in copper pans older than sin. The Victorian breakfast was no idle affair. Even a moderately sized household expected trays of bacon, kippers, kidneys, bread loaves stacked like manuscripts, and at least 8 regional interpretations of porridge. Heaven help the cook who ran out of marmalade. And poor marmalade. It was both a preserve and a boundary. See, breakfast wasn't just food, it was theatre. Upstairs, the gentry consumed it as ritual. Downstairs, it was survival. The servants didn't dine together like amiable hobbits singing songs. No, they took their breakfasts in shifts, dodging chores and hierarchy. The butler's breakfast was not the same as the boot boy's, and there was politics in every corner. The parlour maid tried not to be seen by the lady's maid, who tried not to be accused of using the good jams. Back in the hallways, the housemaids were at war with dust, eternal dust. You'd think, in an age without automobiles, rock concerts, or puff pastry factories, the dust would be manageable. You'd be exquisitely wrong. Carpets, furniture, even the piano keys, all seemed to generate grime from pure audacity. Armed with brushes and beeswax polish, housemaids shuffled from room to room like tiny, silent hurricanes of order. The laundry maid, on the other hand, was already elbows deep in tomorrow's regrets. She faced mountains of linen that reproduced like rabbits, all demanding the dubious combination of lye soap and brute optimism. Ironing in those days was more like competitive bench pressing. Flat irons were heated on the stove and could also, in a pinch, be used to grill a sandwich or discourage a rat. Let us not forget the bellboard, a somewhat taunting piece of wall furniture covered in tiny brass bells, each connected by a string to an upstairs room. Each bell had its own tone, like notes in a symphony of command, and woe betide the poor footman who misunderstood the difference between the music room and the breakfast room summons. social disaster could loom with one mashed muffin. Still, the servants moved like clockwork, unseen yet essential. The soft whisper behind the grand performance of Victorian gentility. Their world was below stairs, beneath glory but crucial to it, and their mornings, despite their chaos, had a certain rhythm, a choreography of coal and eggs and invisible effort, and always the day began before anyone believed it should. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now hush, dear sleeper. The fireplace cracks softly, and the laundry scent lingers like a memory. Let's step quietly forward, where more dusty corners and kettle boils await. It begins, as all great tales of domestic drudgery must, in the dark. Not poetic twilight or romantic dusk, but the dark, the kind that sits heavily across the world before sunrise, with lamp oil barely burning and the cockroach in the pantry still rubbing sleep from its minuscule eyes. In this pre-dawn gloom, beneath layers of fog and too many woolen socks, the Victorian servant began her ritual not with a yawn, but a silent internal scream muffled by layers of duty, corsetry, and coal dust. You see, the morning routine for the average Victorian servant was less of a routine and more of a small-scale resurrection. Around 4:30 in the morning, which is technically still yesterday if you ask anyone with a soul, the domestic foot soldiers of the British bourgeoisie would shuffle from their narrow beds, bleary-eyed and profoundly unimpressed with life. Let us consider for a moment Maud, our theoretical scullery maid. The lowest rung on an already questionably constructed ladder, Maud's job was essentially to start everyone else's day before being allowed to have one of her own. She would rise before the gentry stirred a toenail, before the butler polished his monocle, and critically, before her own body had thoroughly realized it was awake. Her first task, fire. Glorious, unreliable, ash-sodden fire. Nearly every bedroom and sitting room in a half-decent Victorian home required its own hearth be lit. Ideally, before the house's upper-class inhabitants blinked open their eyes and said poignant things like, bit nippy this morning. Maud, armed with a hefty coal scuttle and the bitter experience of 17 frostbitten fingers, would tiptoe through sleeping estates lighting fires with the urgency of a caffeine-deprived squirrel. All this, knowing full well that if a single ember betrayed her presence, left soot on a rug, or singed an ancestral portrait, she would be blamed not just for the incident, but probably for the Crimean War as well. Of course, fire was just the overture. Next came water. Fetching water in a Victorian household was no leisurely jug filling. No, it was more of an amphibious expedition. Depending on the household's design, the water source could be located outside or on another floor, meaning Maud might spend her first hour of the day lugging pails through hallways so long they had their own weather systems. Meanwhile, the taps, if taps there were, could be moody at best and malicious at worst. You haven't truly lived until you've pumped freezing iron-handled water at 5 a.m. in a corset, while a ghost named Lord Wainscott disapproves of your technique. Still, moved by equal parts responsibility and sheer stubbornness, our sleepy foot soldier would next head to the scullery. The very word sounds like something you'd need a tetanus shot to pronounce. Here lay a curious combination of half-washed dishes, leftover gristle from the night before, and the occasional fully sentient potato. The scullery maid would begin the soul-crushing ballet of scrubbing pans, the size of church bells using brick dust, sand, or the tears of her past self. Somewhere in this morning maze, the cook, but one rank above Maud, and notoriously never a morning person, would materialize. A formidable presence, often smelling faintly of lard and authority. She would bark instructions about warming pans, setting kettles, and locating the ham that had disappeared mysteriously since Tuesday. It had not disappeared. It had simply been absorbed by the kitchen mouse uprising of '87. All this before breakfast. Not theirs, mind you, but the master's. Cooks and kitchen maids collaborated with the ceremonial solemnity of alchemists to prepare breakfast trays that would, ironically, be picked at by disinterested aristocrats still emotionally hungover from their latest game of whist. Toast had to be lightly browned, eggs boiled to a precise squishiness, and tea brewed with the delicate touch of a diplomat avoiding war. Should the morning go exceedingly well, and well is here used lightly to mean no one's hair caught fire and no silver was misplaced. Maud might have 2 minutes to herself beside the kitchen range. She might take a bite of cold porridge, stare lovingly at the scullery walls, and dream of a better world where people reheated their own soup. And yet, amidst the exhaustion and the soot, there was an odd kind of rhythm, a comfort in the routine. The firelight would flicker merrily once stoked, the kettle would finally sing, and the house would begin to groggily creak awake, all without a single aristocrat ever needing to notice the quiet servant ghosting through it all. As morning fully bloomed over the sooty rooftops of London, and carriages began to clatter down the cobbles with the confident chaos of geese in top hats, new tasks awaited our weary maids and stiff-collared lads. Tasks of starch and shoe leather, silver forks and breakfast gossip, while the rest of the house still dozed under draughty eiderdowns and dreams of toast with marmalade. The Victorian household was already being gently shaken awake, not by sunlight, heavens no, but by the careful creaking of slippered feet and an aroma not quite definable, like coal dust, lemon oil, and a faint twinge of regret. It was the scent of servants starting their routines. At the very bottom of the pecking order, both physically and socially, was the scullery maid. If the household hierarchy were a cake, and in this metaphor it often was, the scullery maid was the sticky bit stuck to the plate. Her dawn began before dawn had the decency to show itself. Around 4:30 a.m, she would stealthily rise from her narrow cot, tucked somewhere between the back stairs and mild despair, and begin her descent to the kitchen like a ghost who smelled inexplicably of onions. Her first task? Lighting the range fire. Not one fire, mind you, but often several. Like a pyromaniacal Cinderella, she had to spark hearths into cheery blaze before the house dared wake up. But matches were precious, and coal even more so. So she had to coax flames using yesterday's ashes and a whisper of kindling, gently muttering Victorian sputterings under her breath, which might translate to, "Come on, old girl, just catch, and I'll say my prayers in proper Latin." Once the kitchen was warm enough to thaw a marrowbone, the scullery maid began her symphony of scrubbing. Pots, pans, last night's crusted pudding dishes, she scrubbed with sand, soda, and elbow grease, which was not a product, but rather a Victorian euphemism for "you're doing this forever." Next came the footman, tall, coiffured, and born with an innate ability to knock precisely 3 times and never sneeze near polished silver. While the scullery maid was elbow deep in yesterday's gravy, the footman was brushing boots with a kind of devotion poets rarely afford to sonnets. Now, these boots weren't simple affairs. They had buttons you couldn't fasten without special hooks, and if the gentleman of the house had been to a garden party, well, there'd be mud, grass, and the faintest trace of cucumber sandwiches. The footman's job was to restore them to a shine so notable that nearby mirrors felt professionally threatened. Upstairs, the housemaid's morning began at slightly more civilized hour, say 5 o'clock. She too lit fires. More fires, in grand fireplaces that seemed designed less for warmth and more as a subtle display of your coal wealth. She'd open the great velvet curtains with a flourish that suggested the sun might be grateful for the invitation, and begin dusting every surface imaginable, including ones possibly only visible to angels. Dusting in a Victorian house was like trying to court Lady Featherington without fainting. It was relentless and never fully successful. The ornaments on the mantelpiece alone could number in the dozens, each delicately shaped like a Grecian ruin or an oversized poodle. Meanwhile, the cook was descending from a realm of mysterious authority to oversee breakfast. Even the butler cleared his throat deferentially when the cook marched in, her apron already powdered and her bun wound tighter than society's rules for afternoon gloves. Her realm was the kitchen, her language a dialect of brisk commands and threateningly raised eyebrows. Breakfast was to be ready by 7 a.m, sharp. Porridge, toast, rashers of bacon, poached eggs so soft they'd solicit romantic poetry, and tea, gallons of tea brewed with a fierceness usually reserved for naval battles. And let us not forget polish. The act of polishing in a Victorian home could have been a religion in itself. Brasses gleamed like minor gods under the housemaid's cloth, and silverware was buffed with such vigor you could spot your tired reflection offering you breakfast sympathy. All of this occurred while the family above snored sotto voce, blissfully unaware that their warm porridge had been born from a kind of logistical ballet that began in complete darkness and ended in perfectly golden toast. The rhythm of this morning chaos pulsed through every floorboard and stairwell. A sigh here, a pan clatter there, the unmistakable sound of urgency muffled under layers of propriety and laced-up boots. So you see, while the Victorians were building empires and penning 3-volume novels about social awkwardness, their homes were quietly powered by a battalion of steaming kettles and invisible hands. And as the halls began to warm and the scent of breakfast crept politely upward, something else stirred in the grand drawing room. A bell, a chime, a signal. The upstairs was awake. But before we answer that bell, let's pause, shall we? To fluff the pillow, drift with the scent of toast, and wonder who exactly polished the banister so well you could see last Tuesday inside it. Underneath the great echoing rooftops of Victorian manor houses, beneath the quiet ticking of long-case clocks and the slow unfolding of dawn, there exists a world that begins far earlier than most would deem humane. The realm of the scullery maid. And if you've never heard of her until now, that's quite possibly by design. She was the lowest ranking servant in a great household, so low in fact that there are records of cats being outranked. Her day did not begin when the sun rose, but rather when it entertained the idea. Imagine it, before the first yawns from footmen, before Lady Calthorpe's eyelids so much as twitched in her brocaded bed, the scullery maid was already 2 knuckles deep in yesterday's mutton fat. At 4:30 in the morning, while the rest of the household lay draped across mattresses like forgotten laundry, our dear scullery maid was breaking ice off the water pails in a stone sink, hands raw, apron damp, breath a visible ghost of itself. Her first task, lighting the kitchen fires. Yes, that's right. Rather like being expected to finish a 9-tier wedding cake before anyone hands you flour. In winter, lighting the range could take a good 30 minutes, especially with damp coal and kindling more symbolic than substantial. Matches were expensive and rationed like treasure, so she might begin by stealing embers from the still warm ashes of yesterday's fire, an activity equal parts domestic, heroic, and lightly smouldering. Once the fires were ablaze, and only then, could the rest of the kitchen crew begin to stir. But before they emerged, she had at least one more indignity to cherish, emptying the chamber pots. Yes, it was she who gathered, carried, and emptied the porcelain thunder mugs of the entire servants' floor. Dozens of vessels filled to varying degrees of dismay, like a dreadful wine-tasting one had no choice in attending. And lest you imagine a separate lavatory for the purpose, no. A slop sink in the scullery, the very place where washing up was to be done later, had to suffice. It was a kind of multitasking no one should ever dream of replicating. Meanwhile, upstairs, breakfast was but a glimmer on a menu card. The housekeeper might be reviewing who deserved black pudding and who had sinned enough to receive only toast. But down here, in the creeping warmth of the now awakened stoves, our scullery maid was just starting yesterday's dishes, still crusted and contrary as ever. This was not dishwasher loading, no. Each copper pan, some the size of small bathtubs, had to be scrubbed, scoured and polished, until one could see the stung reflection of their own servitude. And let us not forget the cutlery. Hundreds of pieces of silver that tarnished simply out of spite, requiring a laborious polishing with chalk and elbow grease. Elbow grease, incidentally, not actually a Victorian product, despite its frequent usage. If she was lucky, she might be given a ladle of porridge at some point, lukewarm and shared among frowning pots. And then it was right back to boiling water for laundry, skinning eels, or scrubbing the kitchen flags with sunken eyes and a cracked scrub brush. The scullery maid didn't just wake up early. She lived in perpetual pre-wakefulness. So, far behind everyone else on the social ladder, she might as well have been looking up at the butler's boots. And yet, despite it all, perhaps there was something faintly comforting in her predictability. She had her place in the conga line of domestic efficiency, a rhythmic procession that ticked on like the gears inside a grandfather clock, or more specifically, like the sound of said clock waking her at 4:15. In this barely lit kingdom of kettles and kindling, time ticked forward with a clatter of pots and the quiet endurance of a girl barely past 14. And while the upstairs world dreamt of fox hunts, seances, and scandalous novels, the scullery maid scrubbed in silence, the soft slipper slap of her wet shoes echoing in the half-light. Soon, others would descend. The cook, with her voice like an angry kettle, the kitchen maid trailing behind, hoping the eggs hadn't gone bad. But for now, in the warmth of the soot-speckled hearth, the scullery maid moved like a shadow given purpose, preparing the stage for a day that had already begun before most people's dreams had finished dressing. And speaking of early risers, let us follow the faint scent of soap and candle wax towards someone whose timing had to be more heavenly still. If you were a Victorian servant, the sun didn't rise. You did. Usually with a candle stub in one hand, a heavy sigh in the other, and the unmistakable scent of someone else's breakfast already simmering in your future. Before the grand halls of the manor echoed with the genteel patter of slippered feet and polite coughs behind teacups, it was the servants who had already put in a good day's work. Before breakfast, mind you. On a typical morning, let's imagine you're the scullery maid. Poor you. Very poor you. Hierarchically speaking, you're at the base of the servant pyramid, supporting everyone else with the sheer strength of your scrubbing arm. Your role was not so much underappreciated as it was utterly invisible, which, in Victorian England, was rather the point. Up before the rest of the house stirred an eyelid, you'd be lighting the kitchen fire, hopefully on the first try, or you'd be breathing life into coal like a soot-covered bellows frog. Matchboxes were precious, coal was damp, and your fingers, always mysteriously wet. The fire must be ready not just for breakfast, but for boiling water, warming pans, and baking bread. All of it before anyone else even thought about coffee. Now that the flames were finally doing their licking dance, your next job was probably cleaning yesterday's dishes, which sounds gentle, doesn't it? Like a soft sponge bath for some innocent crockery. Ah, no. This was more of a gladiatorial showdown between elbow grease and congealed porridge. Victorian dishwashing didn't involve bubbles, it involved sand. Yes, sand. The gritty kind you'd feel grinding in your bones if you dared to enjoy a sea breeze afterward. That, and a mystery sludge they optimistically called soft soap, which was equal parts frog spawn and punishment. Meanwhile, upstairs, well, more like slightly less downstairs, the footman was waking up, buttoning his high-collared shirt in 17 precise movements that took only 3.5 sighs. The footman's responsibilities were gravely important, of course, including such pillars of civilization as opening doors with flourish, polishing his calves to a gleam, and carrying things that the butler was philosophically opposed to lifting. But back to our gentle morning chaos. The housemaids, often clad in grey cotton and eternal optimism, would begin the ritual known as dusting everything and pretending you weren't there. Bedrooms needed airing, fireplaces needed emptying, chamber pots needed. Well, you get the idea. If your role included attending to chamber pots, you became well acquainted with the inner lives of your household, particularly their digestion. A privilege, in a way, in a very, very roundabout way. One of the most theatrically Victorian details of the morning routine involved the warming pans. These were long-handled contraptions filled with glowing coals, delicately dragged through enormous bedsheets to toast the chills out before their occupants swanned into bed. But of course, if you weren't careful, or slightly too enthusiastic, you'd set the whole bed alight, which could rather compromise the rest of your employment and the bedding alike. Speaking of bedding, feather beds needed fluffing, not delicately encouraged, violently walloped into shape. Pillows were beaten until full of air again, like bread dough made of dreams, and blankets were folded into the kind of geometry that would impress anyone with a fondness for Euclid. If you worked in the laundry, however, your mornings featured lovely, soothing activities like boiling everything white in great cauldrons. Large garments were stirred like stew, and whites were blued with a little indigo to cheer them up. It wasn't very successful. Laundry at the time still smelled faintly of wet crypt for days afterward. Now, one mustn't forget the cook. An early riser, yes, but one with sherry in her apron and wisdom in her bones. She was the unofficial queen of downstairs, ruling with a wooden spoon and an uncanny ability to poach an egg without looking at it. Her mornings were full of lists, sauces, and yelling, but all of it somehow wholesome, like a thunderstorm that brings fresh bread. She was both terror and tea cake, and all this was before anyone rang a bell. When the first service bell chimed, dainty and decisive, every servant froze like a fox hearing church bells. It meant the house was awake, and so the real dance began. But for now, as coal dust settles in the kitchen and pillows are plumped to perfection, we'll drift down the hall toward another servant, one with keys at her waist and secrets in her step. Someone who's been up just as long as the others, but always seems slightly too calm about it. By the time the rest of the household began to rustle under woolen coverlets and stare suspiciously at the slivers of pale light sneaking around their curtains, the maids had already been hard at work for hours. The sun, too, seemed reluctant to show itself before Mrs. Pritchard's scullery girls, who had developed the uncanny habit of tiptoeing around a draughty manor without waking a single silk-slippered soul, like morning ghosts with buckets. At the heart of this peculiar ballet was the vexing and deeply ritualistic task of lighting the family's many, many fires. An unfireplace room, after all, was as useful as a teapot with no spout. In Victorian Britain, people measured their wealth not only by their land, estates, and obscure cousins in the peerage, but also, rather forthrightly, by how many fires they expected you to light before breakfast. And so, it was on this particular fog-wrapped Tuesday that young Alice, whose name was really Margaret, but who'd been renamed Alice by a sleep-deprived housekeeper, too tired to ask twice, was bent double before the hearth in the drawing room, coaxing the coals with the resigned grace of someone promised a raisin scone if they got through all 12 fireplaces in under 90 minutes. Fire lighting was not, as one might hope, a singular and noble act. No, it was a shivering, sooty endurance sport. First came clearing out last night's ash, always a delicate process when one's only tools are a small shovel, a tin pail, and an apron patch you're not supposed to use but always do. Next, the laying of the fire. This involved selecting from 3 types of fuel, each more persnickety than the last. Softwood kindling for the start, pine if you were lucky, splintery brush if you weren't, followed by tightly rolled newspaper or, if your employer was literary, the torn remains of half-read poetical magazines. Poetry that had failed to move Lady Frances would now, by divine irony, be employed quite literally to ignite something. Hard coal was the final layer, laid like treasure in a pyre of hope and grudging competency. Matches were precious, and not a single one was to be squandered on such things as doubt. If the first one failed, the second had better perform miracles, or Alice would be sent back to Mr. Evans, the footman, who had a thick moustache and thin patience with anyone impeding his tow schedule. Fire successfully lit, it was now time to pretend she hadn't used the corner of the guest room curtains to wipe her hands. No one would notice. Guests came and went. Soot stains, however, were forever. Back in the servants' hallway, the coal maid was delivering more fuel in her miniature wheelbarrow, which squeaked like it was auditioning for sympathy. She wore fingerless gloves and an expression that implied she had personally fought winter and felt it still owed her an apology. Meanwhile, in the upstairs corridor, the under-housemaid, the elusive creature responsible for making beds without disturbing the occupant's dreams or dog, had begun her own silent campaign. Part of this involved gently peeking into bedrooms to determine if someone had stirred. Stirring meant tea trays. Ah yes, the tea tray, central artifact of Victorian diplomacy. It was a skillful meal, too small to be breakfast, but vital enough to distract Lady Agatha from her suspicious dreams about the gardener. The tray consisted of a singularly strong cup of Assam tea, 1 slice of lemon for show, a biscuit made entirely of dust and tradition, and a silence so comfortable you could nap in it. This procession of pre-breakfast rituals continued on like a sleepy waltz, each servant drifting from one act of invisible labor to the next. Boots were polished in basements. Letters were sifted through by candlelight. The watering of wilted ferns became a near religious rite, and the unspoken competition to fold the squarest napkin reached its crescendo sometime before dawn. By now, the kitchen was alive with the simmer and sputter of porridge, the boiling of eggs that had never seen a hen, and the soft clatter of cutlery being counted, twice, for luck. Cook was on her second coffee doused in sherry, which she referred to as getting into character. And somewhere, far upstairs, Lady Agatha stretched, oblivious to the small army that had risen before her to pre-warm her slippers. As the early light finally draped itself across the frost-kissed windowsills, a fresh clatter echoed from the scullery. It was the bread delivery, which meant that somewhere hidden among the potatoes and regrets, it was time for the postal servant to wake up. At precisely 6:15 in the morning, in the scullery of a decently sized Victorian manor, what one might call a modest shoe-shaped palace with delusions of grandeur, the scullery maid began her clanking symphony. One wouldn't expect so much drama from a basin and a bar of carbolic soap, but somehow she managed it. Dishes, pans, and the ghost of yesterday's stew all became unwilling collaborators in a cacophony that, in any modern household, might wake an entire neighbourhood. In a Victorian house, the family slept on, blissfully unaware, nestled in canopied beds with pillows so overstuffed they had their own weather systems. The scullery maid, a creature of damp fingers and eternal dishpan hands, began her ritual before dawn each day. She was the lowest-ranking domestic worker and, incidentally, the one most in direct combat with the real enemies of Victorian life: grease, soot, and cold water. She was also the first in the house to rise and, poetically, if somewhat cruelly, the last to eat. Her broom was not merely a tool, but something of a confidant. As she swept coal dust from the flagstones, she whispered to it about the absurdity of ash being considered both a nuisance and a fuel source, depending on whether you were trying to dispose of it or rekindle a fire. The broom never judged. It just shed bristles and soldiered on, a loyal companion in this shadowy pre-breakfast theatre. In houses grand enough to afford more than one servant, the scullery maid's role was to prepare everything for all the other servants, who would then go about preparing everything for everyone else. A hierarchy of helping hands, tirelessly handing things up the social ladder until they reached Lady Gwendolyn's breakfast tray, the one with the soft boiled egg that had to be boiled precisely 3.5 minutes, or the yolk might commit treason. Meanwhile, above the scullery, the housemaid stirred. She emerged from her narrow servant's cot, hair hastily pinned back with the kind of urgency one usually reserves for wrangling geese, and donned her uniform, a black dress and white apron so spotless it could blind someone at dawn. She descended the stairs with the quiet determination of someone who knew that an unlit gas lamp could startle a colonel's wife into near death. Her first task was to throw open the windows of the drawing room. This was not symbolic. It was, in fact, literal. She pushed open heavy sash windows to let in what can only be described as the respectable chill of morning air. A breeze so invigorating, you immediately regretted its honesty. It swept through the room like a visiting relative who disapproved of doilies and made its opinions known by rearranging them. Next came the ceremonial cleaning of fireplaces. There were many, too many. One for every room, which made Victorian homes warmer in theory, though suspiciously smoky in practice. As the housemaid scooped ash with a small pewter shovel, she sighed, partly from exertion and partly from the knowledge that she would soon lay a new fire, which would burn just long enough for someone to request an extra blanket. By 7 a.m., the cogs of the household were all moving at different speeds. In the butler's pantry, the butler himself, stiff of collar and disapproving by birth, was polishing silver with the sort of reverence one might reserve for a royal christening cup. The footman, marginally better rested, was combing his sideburns in the faint hope Lady Aurelia might descend the stairs and notice his symmetrical jawline. But back in the kitchen, the true pulse of the house beat on. It was breakfast prep time. The cook, reigning monarch of custards and passive aggression, was already at her post, issuing orders with a cleaver in one hand and a scone recipe in the other. The kitchen was warm, filled with the scent of yeast and marmalade dreams. The scullery maid slipped quietly across the slate floor, balancing an armful of scrubbed saucepans like a silver-plated acrobat. Above her, the scent of toasted crumpets was beginning to ascend the floors like a culinary hymn. Outside, the first rays of muted sunshine lit the manor's stone exterior, golden and aloof. Within, the machinery of class and crumbs trundled dutifully forward, one teacup, just one, shy of perilous chaos. And not far from the butler's pantry, the lady's maid was just about to choose the day's first corset. No one ever dreams of being woken up by someone else's clogs clacking across a flagstone kitchen floor at 4:47 in the morning. But in a Victorian household, that particular brand of rude awakening wasn't just common. It practically had its own membership card. And that clattering sound? Likely your housemaid, tiptoeing as aggressively as possible past the servants' bells, armed with a mop and a deep, ancestral resentment of early mornings. We find ourselves now in one of the more curious corners of the domestic sphere, the scullery, a damp, semi-subterranean cubby where Victorian dreams went to mildew. The scullery maid, the absolute bottom rung on the grand and exhausting ladder of servants, started her day before the cook, before the butler, even before the cockerel could sufficiently wind up his cluck. Her job, washing dishes endlessly, but not nice post-dinner dishes. No, she scrubbed crusted soup tureens from the night before, peeled potatoes while silently cursing the aristocracy, and tried valiantly to not succumb to chilblains from the sheer quantity of freezing water poured over her fingers before tea had even been imagined. Let's remember, hot water in a Victorian kitchen wasn't achieved by turning on a helpful tap. Oh no, it involved hauling coal, lighting a stubborn range, persuading the copper to boil with the furious intensity of a small steam engine, and then not scalding oneself in the process. The copper, by the way, being a massive metal vat built into the scullery wall, useful for boiling everything from laundry to questionable sausages, sometimes in the same week, if not the same afternoon. Our dear scullery maid's hands were in hot water nearly all the time, either metaphorically, due to some perceived slight, against a crusty housekeeper, or literally, due to being expected to plunge them into boiling wash basins with the speed of an Olympic dish diver. And yet, somehow, there was beauty in the method of the madness. For as the sun began to pry open the mist over the hedgerows beyond the pantry window, and the walls of the scullery glowed ever so faintly like a freshly buttered crumpet, there was an odd rhythm to it all. The gentle clink of cutlery in a basin, steam rising in ghostly arcs, the occasional sigh of an overworked range. It could almost be poetic, in a bleak, Burnley on a Thursday sort of way. Above her, always above her, the more senior servants would begin to stir. The cook, a woman built like a Christmas pudding left out too long, would appear with all the subtlety of a brass band. She came bearing orders, usually beginning with, "Why haven't you skinned these eels yet?" Or, "The parsnips are judging you, do something about them." Then came the butler, Mr. Wexley, if one was being formal, which everyone definitely was. His morning ritual included polishing the silver until it could be used as a distress mirror for constables at great distances. He performed this duty with solemnity, while inventing entire conversations in his head involving the virtues of Madeira wine and composing mildly erotic letters to Queen Victoria, which were, thankfully, never sent. But back to the scullery. It was, paradoxically, both the most secluded and most chaotic place on the estate. It heard all, saw all, and received none of the credit. While the drawing room hosted whispers of inheritance and scandal, the scullery hosted whispers of mould and undercooked pheasant. And for the young maid, perhaps no older than 14, it wasn't just chores, it was endurance training. For if she washed 1,000 plates without breaking one, she might, one day, be promoted to an upstairs maid. A room of her own, with a tiny window and a chamber pot that didn't serve double duty as an alarm clock. As she scraped yet another pot thick with dried gravy and class tension, the flicker of morning truly began. Upstairs, bells would soon ring, each one a musical note in the overture of another day. The lady would require her morning buttons, the master his aggressively poached eggs, and the dog, Sir Bumbles-esque, his thistle-stuffed boar-shaped pillow. But for now, among the copper pots, early chill, and smells both fragrant and deeply confusing, our young scullery maid lifted her sleeves, sighed a soap-flecked sigh, and readied herself to greet the rest of the house, one teacup at a time. In the hush of that moment, beneath the low beams and above the puddled floor, the world stretched out gently before her, like an unread letter waiting to be unfolded. And not far away, already laced into his too-tight waistcoat and rehearsing his eyebrow lifts in the mirror, the footman was preparing for his own strange and sparkly morning ritual. Just as a faint rose of light began to press gently against the soot-streaked windows of Victorian England, and the city exhaled its overnight coal dust like a man stretching out of a long, wheezy sleep, something magnificent and mildly terrifying occurred in the basement of any respectable townhouse. The boot boy awakened. Now, you might be thinking, the boot who? And that is precisely the correct level of confusion. In the complex ballet of Victorian domestic staff, with all its powdered footmen and iron lattice governesses, the boot boy was the most junior of all. Often no taller than your average hat stand and paid just slightly more than a groan of sympathy, the boot boy was responsible for the critical and curiously sacred task of cleaning the family's boots before sunrise. Boots in Victorian England were less a fashion statement and more a declaration of social dominance. Each button gleaming like the eye of an owl, each sole polished to a mirror's standard. A respectable gentleman could not so much as peer into his drawing-room telescope without pristine footwear. And so, while most of London still slumbered, dreaming of steam engines and scandal, our small hero would lurch from his straw-filled bunk with the tragic solemnity of one who had not yet known a day off. By candlelight and on creaky joints, down the corridor he'd go, past sculleries that smelled faintly of cabbage and wild regret, through a door just off the kitchen where boots, dozens of them, waited like misbehaving schoolchildren. He had at his disposal a rather theatrical kit, brushes of various sizes and stiffness, badger bristle if you were lucky, or goat if your employer was frugal, polishing cloths, blacking wax sold in charming tins with apocalyptically toxic ingredients, and a curved implement whose sole purpose was to hook boot buttons so tight. Mothers wrote to Queen Victoria herself pleading the sleeve designs be changed. The boot boy would kneel before each pair, whispering ancient sock-related curses under his breath, and begin this quiet communion. Brush, wax, buff, repeat. Left boot, left foot, right fate. He developed powerful forearms rivaling Greek sailors, and a squint that could see grime on a shoe at a distance of 20 paces. Sometimes, perhaps under the influence of too little sleep and too much waxy air, the boot boy imagined himself as a wizard, summoning shine rather than fire, casting protective spells of polish over boots destined to stomp through affairs, drawing room diplomacy, or at the very least, dinner with the bishop. There was one peril greater than any blister or missed scuff. If he accidentally left the wrong pair of boots outside the wrong bedroom door. Oh, catastrophe. Chaos would ripple through the household like a gas leak through a parlor lamp. Fathers might march off in their sons' boots, sons in their uncles', and the cook, called in to sort it all, might simply light the coal range a little too fiercely that morning and let everyone fend for themselves. Boot polishing was only the beginning. The boot boy's next duty, once the shoes were lined up like obedient soldiers and the sun broke over the chimney pots, was to help light the master's bedroom fire. Entering said bedroom before a Victorian gentleman had combed his moustache and successfully waxed one eyebrow into submission was not for the faint of heart, but our boot boy was nothing if not courageous. He'd tiptoe into the room, arms full of kindling and coal, hoping the master stirred not at all. Lighting a coal fire was a theatre all its own. Too little air and the flames would sulk, too much and the soot would leap out like gossip from a dinner party guest's mouth. And when the fire finally roared to life, casting long flickers upon wallpaper, whose patterns looked suspiciously like haunted ferns, the boot boy vanished once again, down the stairs, back to the boots, or perhaps onto his next task, whatever it might be. For in the ever-rehearsed opera of the Victorian household, the work of morning was always multitasked, never finished, and often undertaken before even the sun fully showed its face. Here, as the fire cracks and the first sheen of polish catches the sleepy light, we drift gently onward to the next servant's morning mission, just rising on the basement's horizons, as dawn stretched its pale fingers across the soot-smudged rooftops of Victorian London. The household still slumbered. At least the family did. Below stairs, however, things had already descended into organised bedlam. Somewhere between the fire irons and the toast racks, a nearly religious ceremony of soot and domestic devotion was underway. We now turn our attention to one of the most revered, or perhaps reviled, morning tasks of the Victorian servant, blacking the grates. To the modern ear, blacking the grates may sound like some sort of minor wizardry, or perhaps a Victorian rugby manoeuvre. In truth, it was the unforgiving ritual of cleaning and polishing the fireplaces. Each fireplace, mind you, and there were often many. One in nearly every main room, each enthusiastically contributing to the smoggy romance of London's early industrial aesthetic. The ruled world of the Victorian servant began in front of those sooty cavern mouths. The grates had to be emptied of ashes, which were never just sweet, powdery remains of a cheerful family evening, but rather damp, clingy ghosts of half-burnt coal that would drift malevolently into every crevice of one's uniform and soul. Armed with a brush, a bucket, and a questionable sense of optimism, the maid set to work. First, she removed the cinders, carefully setting aside any that appeared unusually well preserved. In an economy tighter than a corset on Sunday, not even partially spent coal went to waste. These noble cinders were set in the cinder bin, where they would wait to be heroically reused in a less important fireplace, perhaps the one in the housekeeper's room. or the rarely used parlour that hosted guests only marginally more important than the family cat. Then came the black-lead polish, a thick, tar-like substance, equal parts elbow grease and alchemy, used to restore the tired grates to a deceptive sheen. The process required rubbing, buffing, and more rubbing, until the iron fixtures were as glistening and dangerous as a well-dressed eel. This polishing ritual covered one's hands in a substance so enduring that 2 lifetimes later, their descendants might still find smudges on heirloom linens, swearing they'd never dabbled with a coal scuttle. Once the grates were cleaned, ashes cleared, and fires laid anew with trembling hope that the master's newspaper might catch gently flame and not stubbornly smoulder, the scene was staged to appear as if it had all occurred effortlessly. The goal was for the master or mistress to swan in with their tea and their unread opinions about politics, never once suspecting the small hurricane that had preceded their entrance. If the fireplaces were the soul of the home, then the morning tea tray was its heartbeat. And naturally, it had to arrive precisely on time and piping hot. Delivering morning tea required stealth, speed, and an internal thermostat capable of withstanding both hot porcelain on your palms and the icy stare of a mistress faced with tepid Earl Grey. The teacup itself had to face exactly the correct direction. The milk jug aligned like a tiny dairy soldier, the sugar tongs ready for genteel pincing. Meanwhile, upstairs, the mistress might be delicately blinking awake in a feather-soft bed, thinking the day had simply begun the way days do, quietly, gently, accompanied by a slow rattle of a tray and a whisper of footsteps. Ignorant, perhaps, of the veritable fanfare of labour that led to that moment. The pre-dawn alarm of the scullery maid, the flint-spark fire-lighting catastrophes, and someone somewhere accidentally setting their pinafore on light smoulder. Of course, not all fires behaved. Lighting a proper Victorian fire was as much craft as science, involving layers of newspaper, kindling, coal, and the prayer that the chimney wasn't housing a disgruntled pigeon, or, worse, a previous attempt at fire lighting. Many a household experienced the fine drama of a drawing room filled with smoke and only the lightest coughing from a determined but mildly asphyxiated butler. It was an unspoken art, a ballet of coals and clockwork, this morning theatre of domestic perfection. And once all 17 fireplaces had been blacked, buffed, and brimming with carefully arranged coal pyramids awaiting ignition, the servant might grab a crust of bread, or better yet, a leftover heel of yesterday's toast, and retreat quietly into the next task, comfortable with the knowledge that they had tamed the household hearths once again. And as the first real morning light began to glow through the frost-laced windows, the house's heart now stoked and warm, there was something poetically mad about the whole endeavour, a quiet pride in creating comfort for others, even if one's own breakfast was eaten standing up with fire polish still under the nails. But the fires were just the opening act. Down in the servants' quarters, something altogether, and quite literally, stiffer was being prepared. The uniforms. For while the grates might be soot-free, it was now time to starch the living daylights out of some truly uncomfortable garments. As the morning light finally began to seep through the foggy panes of a Victorian townhouse, it met an unlikely adversary, the housemaid already 10 minutes deep into polishing the brass doorknob. One hand buffed in rhythmic circles, the other brandished a cloth with the sort of determined tranquility usually reserved for monks and particularly competitive janitors. Unlike their employers, who still dreamt peacefully beneath embroidered counterpanes, the servants had been awake for quite some time, You see, the day for a Victorian servant didn't so much begin as it simply resumed, because going to bed and waking up again within such a brief window of rest barely counts. This was especially true for the lowliest of the lot, the scullery maid. By this time, she'd already made the colossal journey, barefoot, with hair hastily bundled, from her attic quarters to the icy realm of the basement scullery. There she greeted her oldest friend and worst enemy, the range. Now, the range was no ordinary stove. It was, in fact, a cast-iron beast with appetite and attitude. Lighting it was a treacherous ritual involving newspaper twists, precise pokings, and hopeful mutterings. Occasionally, it responded with a gentle crackle. More often, it puffed smoke directly into one's face as if to say, "Try harder, Susan." With the fire lit, or at least grudgingly smouldering, the scullery maid moved on to scrubbing yesterday's pans, which, despite being cleaned the night before, had somehow become even greasier by morning. This is one of the lesser-known mysteries of the 19th century. Historians have theories, most involving lingering roast drippings and resentment. Upstairs, the housemaid continued her pilgrimage, wiping baseboards, flicking dust from mantel clocks shaped like Corinthian ruins, and emptying chamber pots with a grace that belied their contents. It's important to remember that indoor plumbing in 1850s Britain was not so much a convenience as a distant hope, sort of like weekends or lower back support. But perhaps the most ceremonious of all morning duties involved cleaning the grates. Now, to our modern ears, that may sound quaint, even poetic. Cleaning the grates. Perhaps a gentle musical interlude accompanies that phrase in your mind. But reality was something else entirely. First, the grate had to be emptied of yesterday's ash, which was not the floating Cinderella kind, but the thick, clinging black fog that turned hands sooty and eyebrows ambitious. Then, the coals had to be sifted. Sifting coals doesn't mean separating the good from the bad. It means convincing the ashes that what they previously covered was still useful. It's a bit like digging through a garbage bin with unwavering optimism. The real pièce de résistance, though, was blackleading, the artful application of a graphite-based polish that turned iron fixtures into gleaming jet-black masterpieces. While the world upstairs obsessed over society columns and the latest scandal involving someone's cousin marrying slightly beneath themselves, below stairs, blackleading was a performance worthy of applause, if anyone had free hands, which they didn't. Meanwhile, the butler, that rare creature of composed dignity and tailor-fitted waistcoats, had risen at a gentlemanly early hour of precisely 6:30 a.m. That may sound brutal to some, but the butler did not wash kettles. No, his mornings involved reviewing the silver, checking the wine cellar's temperature without actually drinking anything before noon, and ensuring the front hall table bore the correct edition of the Times, ideally unfolded in a manner that suggested ease but not slovenliness. There was also the tricky affair of the gong. In larger homes, meals were announced not with a whisper, but with a resounding gong, which the butler had to strike with delicate aggression. Too soft, and the sound would be lost among floor scrubbings and stair sweepings. Too hard, and someone upstairs might spill their shaving cream in fright. It was, as they say, a fine line between notifying and terrifying. By now, breakfast was nearly ready, presented in styles not unlike a royal banquet. Eggs done 4 ways, kippers, toast, marmalade, tea, weak tea, stronger tea for emergencies, all placed delicately on the dumb waiter and ferried up to the dining room. And as the first spoon clinked in a porcelain bowl upstairs, Downstairs, the kitchen maids exchanged sleepy nods of victory, knowing they had survived yet another morning. With aprons dusted and kettles steaming, the house was alive, or at least twitching, ready to meet the needs of yet another day within the lace-curtained hive of Victorian routine. And as we move on through this quiet cascade of tasks and teacups, let us gently unlace our boots and tiptoe into the next whisper of the morning's rhythm. In the dim hush before dawn, when most of the household still slumbered in their four-poster beds like dreaming walruses under velvet drapery, one curious sound echoed softly through many a Victorian manor, the faint snick of a matchstick, followed by the cautious hiss of gas lighting a flame. Yes, dear listener, we now find ourselves peeking in on perhaps the most heroic and frequently singed of all domestic figures. The humble scullery maid attempting to light the range without either catching fire or waking a butler. Let us be gentle in our judgment. For starters, this girl, often just 13 or 14, cheeks still full of apple flesh and lungs not quite used to soot, had been up since roughly yesterday. Her primary mission, it seemed, was to begin heating water before the sun had even considered warming England. Now, before you imagine some quaintly arranged copper kettle atop a cheerful stove, let me remind you, Victorian water heaters were essentially indoor volcanoes disguised as furniture. The average kitchen range was black, snarling, and made entirely of cast iron. It required a precise, almost courtship-like rapport with kindling, coals, and airflow. If the maid moved too quickly, the fire sputtered. Too slowly, and her morning transformed into one long apology for her lady's tepid bath. She'd begin by removing the ashes from the previous day, a surprisingly spiritual ritual, like clearing the karmic residue of Wednesday's burnt toast and Thursday's poorly cooked parsnips. The ashes were dumped into a bucket the exact weight of disappointment. This too was hauled out of doors, probably in the rain. It was always raining when you carried ashes. That's simply how fate works. Then, new coals were fetched. These were stored in the coal cellar, affectionately known among the staff as the world's least joyful cave. If you're picturing a boutonniere of black dust delicately coating every surface, give yourself a sleepy gold star. You'd be right. As the scullery maid crouched before the cold iron maw and coaxed the flame to life with fingers routinely blackened, she might dream about anything other than fire. Some dreamed of library books and strawberry jam. Others dreamed of the rare day off, when one's greatest challenge was navigating a borrowed umbrella in a London breeze. Now, should the fire awaken properly, crackling like a polite round of applause in a church, the next phase began. Water, buckets of it, carried from a pump outdoors, or, if the household were especially posh or experimental, perhaps piped in from the new indoor plumbing, still extremely up and coming and liable to explode spontaneously in the year 1874. Water was poured into vast copper boilers with the grace of a three-legged waltz. It would heat slowly, grudgingly, like an old professor asked to lecture during a heat wave. And once warm, it would be ladled out and carted upstairs to fill the separate basins and ceramic ewers of every superior being still dreaming peacefully in embroidered pajamas. Let us not forget the erratic yes-no-maybe etiquette over who was permitted hot water and who was expected to simply be grateful for the experience of washing. Mistress got steaming towels scented with lavender. Junior footmen were lucky to get anything above freezing. All this before breakfast. But even as the range breathed its first smoky sigh and the pink tips of dawn spread through the east-facing pantry window like a bashful rosiness, Something else stirred above. An orderly creak on the back stairs. Enter the housemaid. She was next in this relay of rising souls, the next keeper of light and order. Whereas the scullery maid quietly kindled fire, the housemaid dealt in sunlight, or the convincing illusion thereof. Curtains must be drawn, chamber pots discreetly emptied, and a good deal of dusting done stealthily enough not to startle awake Lord Wensleydale and his extremely fragile moustache. By the time the upstairs bells began their infernal clanging, a language all their own, equal parts Morse code and nervous breakdown, the table downstairs was already being laid. The fire gleamed, the tea was steeping. Toast began its slow, noble journey toward golden perfection. And so the morning ballet waltzed on below stairs, graceful in its rigidity, reverent in its fatigue. Beyond the scullery, past the coal cellar, and just beside the larder, someone had begun to polish the boots. But that, my drowsy dear, is another tale for another fire-warmed moment. And beneath the low-clouded breath of a soot-stained London dawn, the housemaids continued their quiet ballet. By 5:30, most of the Victorian upper crust was still dreaming grandly of opera boxes or empire expansions, neither of which required them to know what coal dust did to cuticles. But below stairs, amid the musty aroma of unused drawing rooms and the unmistakable perfume of baking soda and resignation, a curious ritual quietly unfolded, the laying of fires. It may sound romantic in a bleak, Jane Eyre kind of way. Picture a solitary figure moving room to room, lighting hearths as though summoning warmth from the brickwork spirits. Reality, though, was colder, both metaphorically and literally. The art of laying a proper Victorian fire was an essential housemaid skill, and, strangely enough, one fraught with melodrama, hierarchy, and more suit than seems legal. Seniority mattered. The highest ranking of the lower ranking, typically the first housemaid, claimed the choicest grates. Those in the master's suite, or perhaps the morning room, where Sir Reginald would marvel aloud, "Don't know how you make such lovely fires, Briggs," never once suspecting Briggs had a name, and that it was Margaret. Trainees, or new girls from the countryside still smelling faintly of optimism, were sent to the coldest, most disagreeable grates. These were typically found in guest bedrooms that hadn't seen guests since the Crimean War, but whose fireplaces had to be lit nonetheless since appearances. Well, they are everything. There was an exacting order to the process. Yesterday's ashes had to be removed and carried out with monk-like silence, lest they disturb a sleeping household. Clank the grate or sneeze at the wrong moment, and you'd be summarily assigned to boot scrubbing for a week. Then, a carefully constructed bundle of kindling, wood shavings, and rolled-up newspaper would be laid down like a stage for coal's dramatic entrance. The coal, that sooty lord of Victorian warmth, was placed atop in a pyramid of calculated optimism, ready to blaze or sulk depending on the mood of the morning. Matches were struck with the reverence of medieval monks lighting altar candles, except with slightly more muttering under the breath. If a fire failed to catch, the housemaid would employ the bellows, or, failing that, frantic blowing with cheeks that quickly matched the hearth for redness. It was labour in the service of illusion, the idea that warmth simply shimmered into bourgeois life, summoned not by toil, but by sheer class. Once the last of the fires was alight, housemaids would pass back down the narrow servant stairs, cheeks glowing not with satisfaction, but combustion-induced exertion. With luck, they'd arrive in the scullery just in time for a stolen sip of weak tea, and maybe a glance out the frosted window, a reminder of the world beyond chimney flues and antique andiron sets. The silent choreography of fire kindling was not merely about heat, it was about rhythm and routine, the symphony of subservience that girded every gurgling teapot and crisply folded napkin upstairs. These fires were not just physical, they symbolized the invisible labor that kept the aristocracy pleasantly lukewarm through even the foggiest seasons. Curiously, one could tell the social rank of a household by the number of fires the maids were expected to light. In a modestly affluent home, perhaps 12. In the homes of the truly gentry adjacent, 20 or more. And in the great country houses, well, upwards of 50 fireplaces could burn merrily while the maid's eyebrows slowly vanished into history. There was something almost meditative about it, like a sacred chant. The scratch of the poker, the crinkle of newsprint, the soft hiss as a flame caught and curled upward. In the silence before the household stirred, you could almost hear the heartbeat of the house itself. One small pulse in every grate, warmed by the quiet persistence of those whose names history seldom remembers, but whose fires kept the world turning. And somewhere, just as the amber light began to ripple across the parlour's fringed chaise longue, the housekeeper would appear, carriage erect and tea-fueled, ready to inspect, correct, and perhaps, on unusually generous days, to nod once in appreciation. But there was no time to bask in the glow. As the rooms grew warmer, so too did the tempo of duties awaiting the staff. There were beds to strip, brass to polish, and somewhere, inevitably, a master's cousin to accidentally surprise with marmalade-stained gloves. Still, for now, let's remain here in the quiet warmth of the guest room fire, where the flickering glow dances on faded wallpaper and long-forgotten portraits. The house breathes, and the morning advances, and the next task tiptoes close behind. Of all the mysterious tools wielded in the early morning ballet of the Victorian household, none held such quiet power, nor wielded it with such damp persistence as the humble scullery maid. She was the first to rise, often slinking down from her attic bed, while the stars still blinked drowsily in the inky sky, her heavy boots muffled by layers of woolen stockings, and a personal vow not to wake the cook, who would be most irate if her pre-dawn nap were interrupted again. The scullery maid's domain was the kitchen, specifically the stone sink, the soapy bucket, the perpetually misbehaved goose grease, a battalion of pots, and an endless parade of cutlery. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even sanitary by modern standards, but it was, in every musical clink and slosh, the choral warm-up to the household's daily performance. The floor, of course, had to be scrubbed before anyone else dared glance at it. If a butler stepped down to oversee the morning sherry, which wasn't technically a thing, but they liked to pretend, and his polished shoes picked up a single crumb, well, disaster. The kind of disaster that warranted 2 raised eyebrows and, if things were truly dire, calling the scullery maid young lady, in a tone that suggested great disappointment and possibly mild indigestion. So the poor girl wielded her scrub brush like a knight's lance, attacking invisible flowery villains left from the cook's late-night pudding production. She worked in rhythm, the same way you or I brush our teeth while half asleep. Left stroke, right stroke. Pause to unwedge a carrot peel from the drain like a villainous sea creature clinging to its lair. Repeat. By 6 o'clock, her hands resembled soggy gloves that had once, long ago, heard rumours of softness. She'd grown adept at ignoring the early morning chill that sat in the kitchen air like a sulky ghost. That room never quite caught the warmth, even after the range was lit. Perhaps it was built that way, stone flagged and insulated only by generations of burnt-on porridge. It's easy in our modern world of electric kettles and insulated travel mugs to forget how thoroughly water resisted boiling in the Victorian era. The scullery maid knew this struggle intimately. She placed the giant copper kettle on the stove with all the reverence of a church bell ringer. Then she waited and waited until the water reached the appropriate, almost boiling but not quite don't rush me stage, during which time she usually rinsed yesterday's chamber pots. Yes, those. It was, to put it lightly, a job that inspired neither poetry nor passion, but it possessed a certain rhythm, a meditative kind of hopelessness that was oddly soothing. After all, once you've cleaned a dozen grimy forks balanced in a tower of porridge-welded crockery, existential dread just doesn't hit the same way anymore. The scullery maid had no time for dread anyhow. After clearing last night's debris and preparing for breakfast carnage, she turned her attention to polishing. Everything had to shine. The brass pans, the iron knives, the mysterious copper coil that no one remembered the purpose of. But oh, how it gleamed when polished. She was invisible, of course. That was the role. Not as punishment, but as a kind of profession. Much like the best stagehands, her success was measured by her ability not to exist, while ensuring everything else worked beautifully. Her hands might be red, swollen, and perpetually scented of onions and vinegar, but the breakfast trays glowed, and the boots were lined up like disciplined soldiers. Sometimes, if the early sun cooperated and the windows hadn't yet fogged over with the morning's stew vapors, she'd glance out and catch the tiniest sliver of sky, a hopeful sort of blue arched far above the chimney smoke, untouched by soot or soup. And for a moment, she might stand still, brush in hand, and breathe in a clean kind of tired only earned through sincere blistered work. Breakfast for the family would begin soon, and then the rest of the kitchen staff would descend like caffeinated wolves. But for these fleeting moments, the scullery maid reigned alone, queen of the soap and sovereign of the slop bucket, holding dominion over the quiet before the domestic storm. Of course, soon enough, there would come the cook's resounding entrance, a woman of terrifying respectability and the strict belief that potatoes had only 6 acceptable textures, and the day would truly begin. But there, still nestled in the silence of dawn, a new cast member was preparing to step onto the household's grand stage. And speaking of dramatic entries, the arrival of the footman was nothing short of operatic. If you had wandered into the scullery of a Victorian townhouse, just as the pale fingers of dawn crept across the soot-smudged windows, you might have been serenaded, not by birds, but by the clanking of kettles, the occasional splash of boiling water, and perhaps the low hum of a kitchen maid cursing softly in rhyme at a particularly obstinate coal bucket. The scullery, you see, was the watery heart of the domestic operation, a moist kingdom of dishwater, dripping laundry, and cold stone floors that could chill even the most determined cheer from one's toes. And presiding over this damp dominion, the scullery maid, a creature of near mythical constitution, the scullery maid was almost always the youngest member of the household staff. So young, in fact, she often still looked half-baked. But make no mistake, she was responsible for work hardened enough to put iron into anyone's metal. Her mornings began even before the housemaids stirred from their straw-stuffed mattresses, and certainly before the masters of the house began dreaming socially acceptable dreams involving cravats and carriage horses. Her first task was lighting the kitchen fire. Victorian coal was not known for its good manners, and she'd often spend 20 furious minutes trying to coax reluctant flames from damp kindling, which, if the cook was watching, had better succeed or else. It's said some scullery maids developed the unique skill of whispering threats directly into the hearth. If you don't catch this time, I'll turn you into cinder soup. With the fire blazing, or let's be frank, sulking, she would haul pans large enough to boil a modest goat, filling them with water from the pump, while forgetting entirely that her arms were not detachable. This boiling water would later trickle down into every corner of the household, warmed for tea, for shaving, and for the occasional grudging bath offered to a once-a-month uncle guesting in the drawing room. But the scullery didn't just do water. It dabbled artfully in drudgery. Every copper pot, every soot-black kettle, every meat-stained carving knife returned from the night before had to be scoured. And scoured, in this case, meant something very unpoetic, scrubbing them with sand or ash, which, while beautifully medieval in concept, did nothing polite for the hands. Gloves, you ask? Oh no, dear listener. Wearing gloves was for gentlewomen and dockside burglars. The only protection our scullery maid had was the thick carapace of grit forming across her knuckles. Occasionally, she'd be sent to clean the chamber pots, an aromatic adventure involving sloshing porcelain, the horrifying early cousin of toilet deodorant, and a game of try not to think about it, played very intensely indeed. If she was lucky, the pots were merely disgusting. If she was unlucky, well, we'll spare the olfactory details in favour of your sleep. And what did she eat to sustain this whirlwind of dawn-breaking toil? Depending on the household, scullery maids might snag a crust of bread nicked from yesterday's loaf, and, on particularly bountiful mornings, gaze longingly at the bacon cooking for everyone else. If she was favoured, and favoured here meaning not actively scowled at, the cook might toss her a dry corner or a dribble of gravy. A Victorian breakfast of champions, it seems, often began with whatever didn't end up on the floor. Yet, strangely, amidst all of that early morning discomfort, the scullery maid developed a certain camaraderie with the stillness. When she looked outside past the washtub, before anyone else stirred, she had the kitchen to herself and the company of pigeons. Not romantic pigeons, mind you, just appropriately grimy ones nesting in the eaves. It was her own quiet empire before the clamour began. And as the bells upstairs began to tinkle, the infernal summoning system Victorians used like Morse code for "bring me tea" or "I've dropped my monocle," she would vanish back into the background, like some domestic ghost, forever wiping invisible jam off a fork, forever behind the scenes. But the funny thing, while the drawing rooms were full of lace and ladylike twitters, and the bedrooms ringing with tinkling bell pulls and the soundless footfalls of slippers, the scullery maid knew where the real skeletons of the household were buried, sometimes quite literally. Never underestimate the power of someone who holds the keys to the soot bin, the dish bluff, and that one drawer where all the matches disappear to. Next, we glide gently upstairs, where the housemaids begin their subtle dance with dust, the silent enemy that never truly sleeps, much like their schedule. Once the sun breached the horizon and had the audacity to dazzle the frost-laced windows of a Victorian London townhouse, the footman had already been awake for hours. Now, if you're picturing a dashing young man in a waistcoat practicing his smoulder in the mirror while polishing the family silver with panache, pause, dear listener, rewind. The truth is marginally less glamorous, but far more charming in its own soot-dusted way. The footman's morning routine was a ballet of precisely scheduled obedience, often beginning in complete darkness, well before the master's or mistress's alarmingly loud throat clearing summoned the house to life. While the cook was busy coaxing flames to behave in a sullen range below stairs, the footman was engaged in an obscure domestic art, warming the privy seat. Yes, not warming as in warming up to the idea of it, but physically warming the master's toilet seat. It was a task handled with such care and practicality. You'd think it was taught in finishing schools. A small pan of hot coals, carefully balanced, would be slid beneath the wooden seat just moments before use. And should the master rise unexpectedly early, the footman might find himself in a dramatic race against time with nothing but coals and courage. Once lavatorial comfort was secured, it was time for the great awakening. Each fireplace in the house needed to be cleaned of its ashen memories from the day before. Ash, in case you've never personally frolicked in it, has an uncanny desire to cling to everything except the dustpan. The footman, wielding his regulation-issued stiff brush like a knight in sooty armour, would remove the ash, relight the fire with kindling arranged like an offering, and pray to the gods of combustion that it would catch on the first attempt. It seldom did. In larger households, one ominously named item demanded the footman's attention with queenly importance: the gong. Not some mystical item from an Arthurian fable, but a literal brass gong hanging near the dining room entrance, used to summon family members to breakfast, dinner, or emergency family meetings about why Gerald left his gloves in the conservatory again. Striking the gong was an art. Too soft, and you'd be accused of timidity. Too loud, and you'd ruin Mrs. Featherstone's digestion. Legend has it that one particularly ambitious footman gave the gong such a spirited jingling that it resonated for several minutes, prompting a momentary crisis as the family worried they were under siege. He was reassigned to polishing banisters. Speaking of banisters, those unfortunate railings had to be polished daily until they shone like mirrors in a horror film. The Victorians had a curious obsession with making things gleam. Banisters, doorknobs, boot buckles. If it didn't glint in the candlelight, you weren't doing your job. Rumour has it that some households judge footmen not by their manners or marrowbone-carrying technique, but by how many reflections they could spot in a newly buffed banister swirl. And then came the boots. Oh, the boots. Most footmen were fluent in the intricate dialect of boot maintenance, which involved blacking, brushing, buffing, and a thing called elbow grease, which, while not available for purchase, was apparently essential. Leather had to gleam, soles had to be intact, and the unpleasant reality of what Victorian streets might leave on said soles had to be vanquished entirely. But for all the scrubbing, scouring, and soot-based sorcery, footmen often found moments of strange stillness in their mornings. The fire crackling agreeably after finally catching, the early light spilling in through grime-streaked glass, the faint clink of breakfast dishes being set upstairs. In that half hour before the house really woke, there existed a kind of quiet dignity in their bustling. And though their tasks were manifold and often thankless, footmen held a peculiar place of honour in the social architecture of the home. Half antique furniture, half whispering shadow, always ready, never seen. Unless, of course, the bell rang. And it always rang. Which brings us to the next delicate phase of the household's awakening, when the lady's maid tiptoed into action, corsets in hand, and the real day began with laces, scent bottles, and the delicate art of second opinions on skirt flounce. Sometimes, in the deepest crook of morning, when the cobblestones are still whispering their dreams from the night before, a single servant is awake, wrapped not in a blanket, but in duty, This is the scullery maid, a creature so foundational to the Victorian household that if she vanished, the very concept of clean spoon would crumble like a wet digestive biscuit. The scullery maid's morning began where your worst kitchen nightmare ends. By around 4:30 a.m., when even ghosts are hitting snooze, she was already creeping down narrow servant hallways, armed with nothing but a thick apron and that special, unteachable ability to clean something while still half asleep. Her journey began at the scullery sink, a medieval-looking trough where cold water dwelled in eternal gloom and soap murmured tales of chipped bone china. The copper kettle awaited her summon. Made of metal so heavy it counted as a light workout, the kettle had to be filled with water and then perched delicately over the range, all without making enough noise to wake the cook. In the household hierarchy, the cook was just below God and slightly above the lady of the house, and had the temper of both. Waking her early could result in anything from a verbal flaying to the sudden materialization of broad beans in your supper. Once the water was warming, the scullery maid set about scrubbing yesterday's disasters. Frying pans still glistening with proud Victorian lard, roasting trays adorned with the carbonic echo of last night's lamb. She scrubbed not only for cleanliness, but so the cook wouldn't judge the pans like an exasperated art critic. She scrubbed with circular motions that philosophers might have mistaken for meditation. And in those circles, she thought about warmer socks, about eloping with the footman to Scotland, about whether cheese dreams really told the future. With the pans scrubbed, kettles boiling, and mere hours left until the upper servants awoke with their hair set in the precise manner of royal topiary, it was time for the ritual laying out of breakfast accoutrement. The scullery maid never laid hands on things like eggs or toast. That was far too glamorous. But cups she knew. Soiled ones, porcelain ones that sounded hollow when tapped and made you question the true substance of bone china. It was she who placed the pot out for tea, cleaned and warmed, and respectfully recused herself before the butler arrived to commence his rightful reign over the teapot. The butler would then emerge from whatever dignified sleep cocoon he inhabited and act as though the tea had brewed itself through sheer class and British forethought. Now, while you might expect that scrubbing things with wooden brushes in a chilly stone-walled chamber might encourage some drama, scullery maids were often known for their unshakable resilience and their scandalous knowledge of who dropped what in the soup. For though positioned lowest in the servant pecking order, they overheard everything. Their proximity to sinks, bins, and muttering footmen made them unwitting keepers of half the household's whispered tragedies. But the scullery maid's toil was far from solitary. She was watched by something. No, not a ghost. Worse, the family cat. Cats held a unique position in Victorian households. They floated freely between floors, respected by all, house pets one moment, minor deities the next, and they always sat in places that made you question how physics was supposed to work. The kitchen cat would often supervise the scullery maid, staring with judgmental yellow eyes from atop a drying rack or loaf of bread. It never blinked. It never helped. It simply demanded that one day, when the revolution came, it would be fed promptly at dawn. By the time the sun slipped a hesitant peach-coloured toe over the alleyways, the scullery maid had washed 17 dishes, half a dozen pots, and a quantity of knives that would give a modern dishwasher an existential crisis. Her hands were acquainted with every crack in the clay floor and every chip in a royal Dalton saucer. And yet, as she took a moment in the doorway, the scent of fresh ash and steel soap clinging to her like perfume, she might have dared to feel a flicker of pride. The house wasn't glamorous yet, but it was ready. And sometimes, just sometimes, when no one was looking, she warmed her feet by the range and sighed with the simple grace of someone who'd scrubbed an empire into motion. As the rest of the household began to stir, feet creaking on boards, bells twitching on long overhead wires, the day prepared to truly begin, which made one wonder, what of those who didn't scrub, but ruled over keys? Curious that, and something worth drifting into next. There was one servant whose morning routine positively shimmered with quiet significance, although she would never admit it. She was the lady's maid, often mistaken for simply a glorified brush wielder or a walking wardrobe assistant. The lady's maid held a serene kind of power. After all, she was the first to touch the silk and the last to see the hairpins before they disappeared into that intricate jungle known as ladies' hair. Her day began when the mist still clung to the window panes like melancholy ghosts, before the mistress stirred, before the cook yawned, and certainly before the master of the house reached for his shaving soap. She was already up, undetectable as morning fog, meticulous as clockwork. One might say she rose at an hour when only owls and regrets were still awake. Slipping into her uniform, washed and pressed by her own hand the night before, she moved with a sort of practiced silence, developed from years of being the unseen architect of another person's appearance. In the hush of her attic room, no larger than a generous broom cupboard, she leaned over her own small pitcher and basin, splashing cold water onto her face with the crisp resolve of someone whose professional life depended on not having puffy eyes. Then came her first sacred duty of the day, preparing the bedroom fireplace. Yes, her mistress's boudoir must be warm before toes dared greet the morning slippers. So, down she would tiptoe, avoiding creaky floorboards like stepping stones in a marsh of social ruin. A single creak outside the mistress's door could spell a week of icy glares and pointed silences. Thus began her ballet with the coal scuttle, using fireplace tongs like holy instruments. By the time a faint orange glow bloomed to life behind the grate, so too did her routine bloom into its next phase, laying out the mistress's morning toilette. The gloves, the stockings, buttoned, never rolled, the corset so stiff it could stand up and fight Napoleon, and of course the undergarments, which multiplied in curious ways the closer one looked at Victorian fashion. There were chemises, petticoats, bloomers, drawers, bustles, the odd whalebone or two. Dressing a Victorian lady was not unlike constructing a modest human battleship. None of this could be done haphazardly. There were social rules even for drawers. Flower embroidery, daytime, plain hemmed edges, much too casual for visitors from the vicarage, buttoned at the side or the back. Yes, depending on how scandalous the season was feeling. After setting the wardrobe arrangement with the devotion of a museum curator, our lady's maid turned to hair. Hairdressing, in the Victorian world, was a bit like sculpture plus geometry, minus the helpful concept of done. Hair wasn't finished until it stood at a minimum altitude and involved at least one piece of cutlery used as support, often a hat pin, sometimes a knitting needle in desperate times. The maid would select her brushes, all properly cleaned with a special small brush designed for cleaning brushes. It's a fractal of broomsticks, a matryoshka of maintenance, bristles of wild boar, handles of polished wood, and more secrets braided into those curls than any diary dared whisper. She'd warm the curling iron on the edge of the hearth, protective paper always at the ready, because no one wanted a scorched fringe, especially not the mistress. When the lady finally called out with a lazy, Maud, because of course, all ladies' maids were named Maud, at least in spirit. The transformation would commence. Very few saw the lady's maid during these sacred hours. She was part morning mist, part hairstylist, part confessor. The mistress would grumble about the rector's long sermons, while Maud pinned curls with gentle, diplomatic nods, never agreeing, never disagreeing, like a political envoy made of hair oil and self-discipline. And yet, curious as it may seem, Maud rarely got a moment for herself. No steaming cup of early tea like the scullery maid, no clandestine grumbles over cold ash like the footman. Her world was quiet, precise, and bound by a ritualistic cloth. But she had her secrets. At the bottom of her sewing basket were letters rewritten and never sent. In her hidden corner drawer, wrapped in a yellowed handkerchief, was a pressed flower from one of her only early morning walks off duty, a whole decade ago. And sometimes, in the solitude of curling another person's hair, she would imagine she was dressing herself. Not for duty, but for something suitably vague and poetic, like a romantic drive in Lord Someone's carriage, or an impassioned poetry reading that ended in light refreshments. As the coiffure rose to its perfect arch, like a cathedral for the forehead, and the mistress dabbed perfume behind her ears, Maud melted back into the gentle invisibility that kept the whole house from unraveling. Now let's softly descend the stairs again, not to the scullery just yet, but toward a hushed, flickering corridor, where the butler has already begun polishing the silver with the intensity of a man fighting both tarnish and existential dread. By the time the sun had decided to peek shyly over the rooftops of Victorian London, blushing behind a veil of coal smoke and seagull complaints, the cook had already waged her first battle of the day. Armed with a battered apron, formidable forearms, and an intensity that could whip porridge into submission with a single glare, she had conquered the scullery long before her employer had even rustled beneath their monogrammed eiderdown. Morning for the Victorian cook began not with a chirpy alarm or latte art, but with fire. Stone floors cold as Dickensian despair beneath slippered feet. She'd shuffle into the cavernous kitchen before 5 o'clock, lighting the massive range stove that was approximately the size and temperament of a small iron demon. It didn't merely respond to matches, it demanded them. Coals were coaxed, wood was fed, and the damper and flues worked like the controls of a steamship. Once ablaze, the range transformed from icy menace to uncontrollable furnace, radiating both warmth and mild resentment. With the fire underway, the day's work could truly begin. That is, after a little something called skimming the drippings. You see, every respectable Victorian household was powered not by electricity, but by grease. Bacon grease, goose grease, all-purpose, multi-species grease ladled off of last night's dinner and stored in cheerful pottery jars marked drippings. This culinary currency would later be spread on toast, rubbed on cast iron, used in hair pomade, or possibly all three, depending on the ambition of the household. The cook's morning preparations resembled Olympic-level multitasking: eggs to poach, ham to fry, kippers to broil into existential submission. And every item had to be presented with the correct amount of sweat-based flair. All this while ensuring that the kitchen maid, who had only recently recovered from hauling up the morning water, didn't accidentally burn the toast for the third time this week. Toast, in fact, was a rather delicate matter. Rather than simply dropping it into a slot and pushing a lever, as we might, Victorian toasting involved long-handled wire cages held over open flames, while one prayed to the gods of consistent browning. It was a form of breakfast-based interpretive dance. Meanwhile, up in the butler's pantry, a very different sort of breakfast drama was unfolding. The butler, stoic, moustached, and a man who had memorized the exact decibel level of acceptable marmalade placement, savored these early hours as his moment of unbothered precision. Glass polishing commenced with military-grade discipline. Woe betide anyone who smudged a decanter. He would carefully decant the morning port. Yes, the Victorian upper crust believed in port for breakfast. Why take your gout sitting down? And align the teaspoons just so, all while practicing the exact facial expression of respectful invisibility. But back to the kitchen, where the cook, queen of the underworld, had begun issuing orders through a veil of steam. Cold meats were sliced, breads were sliced, tomatoes were sliced. It was a veritable festival of slicing. Somewhere someone was probably slicing butter just for the drama. If the family had guests, matters grew even more fraught. One could not simply plate breakfast. It had to be arrayed. Frills, garnishes, little sprigs of parsley that no one ate, but that nevertheless served as a silent green testament to the cook's painstaking artistry. Tea was poured into pre-warmed porcelain. Coffee, thick and likely caffeinated enough to rouse the family ghosts, was prepared in a silver percolator that hissed with aristocratic judgment. And then, just before the grand unveiling, came the final ritual, the servants' breakfast. For though the staff worked while hungry, one could not reasonably expect a footman to stand perfectly straight, or a lady's maid to lace a corset with appropriate cheer on an empty stomach. The servants ate quickly and together, tucking into bread slathered in a socially acceptable amount of lard, perhaps a dense oatcake or two, and, if the household was particularly generous, the occasional half of a sausage. It was eaten standing up, with one ear always tuned to the sound of an upstairs bell. Because once the family rang, breakfast was no longer a meal. It was a performance, and the curtain, dear listener, was about to rise on another rather toast-centric act. The ironing maid, perhaps the most underestimated of servants, lived a life of quiet, steamy resilience. While others in the Victorian household were running to fetch coal buckets, polish chamber pots, or dodge Lady Pembroke's yapping Pomeranian, the ironing maid lurked in the laundry room's warm tomb, surrounded by hiss and the faint scent of scorched fabric dreams. In theory, this job sounded simple. Just press clothes. In practice, it was a marathon of flirtation with fire. Irons in the 19th century weren't plugged in. They were solid hunks of metal, heated over coals or inside special stoves, designed to slowly bake your extremities. A good ironing maid would have had multiple irons lined up like ducks in a row, some heating, some in use, and at least one just slightly too hot, whose sole purpose was to remind her that pain existed. She also had to know the soul of every fabric. Linen needs steam. Wool requires care and prayer. Silk didn't even trust it. A dot of water on silk would bloom into a permanent watermark, like a ghost of a fish had kissed it. A single misstep with the hot iron could leave a shiny scorch as obvious as a sunburn on a bald man. The ironing maid's day began well before sunrise. The house still slept, save for the scullery maid sneezing quietly into her apron and the butler tightening his cravat with the seriousness of a man preparing for battle. And yet, in the heart of the house, the laundry ironer would already be at her post, coaxing the first batch of breakfast shirts into shape. Now, these weren't just any shirts. Victorian garments were practically armoured with pleats, ruffles and collars so starched they could slice a loaf of bread. Every crease had to be precise, every cuff crisp enough to communicate moral uprightness. In a world where outward appearances were shorthand for social class and general decency, the ironing maid was the quiet painter behind every man's respectable silhouette. Yet, what made her life particularly curious was the sheer number of things she was expected to iron. You'd think it ended with shirts and dresses, but you'd be wrong. Tablecloths, napkins, pillowcases. Why, yes, even the undersides of an earl's underpants might receive a spritz if his valet had something to prove. The Victorians were obsessed not only with appearances, but with their under-appearances. One must never be caught looking wrinkled, even beneath one's trousers. Steam was her only ally. If she were wise, and they usually were, she'd have a bowl of water nearby, dabbing the cloth just so, letting out a great whoosh as the iron met damp cotton. It was like taming little clouds, summoning fog from linen, as if she were a sorceress ironing out not just wrinkles, but also the somber musings of unrequited footmen. The ironing room itself was its own moist little ecosystem, warm with high humidity and coats of starch drifting through the air like tiny textile ghosts. It smelled faintly of laundry soap, iron, and occasionally of despair when someone scorched a bishop's surplice. There were times, especially during a late shift, when the ironers spoke in whispers, tales of old scandals in the family, secrets that clung to lace cuffs, whispered through pressed handkerchiefs. Despite the effort and sweat, there was an unspoken pride among these steam-summoning warriors. It took an eye for perfection and calves of iron to stand all day. For every gentleman who posed before a mirror to admire his starched collar, there was an ironing maid downstairs quietly satisfied with the elegant angle of that pleat. Her fingerprints were on every vest, every crinoline, every square of lace under a candlelit chandelier. And if she was feeling particularly rebellious, she might leave the tiniest wrinkle behind, a harmless ripple, a whisper of resistance, proof that real humans still existed beneath all the starch. So now, as the morning light begins to filter through the soot-dusted windows, glinting on polished irons and baskets of crisp linens, the ironing maid straightens her back, lays another waistcoat on the board, and lifts the next iron. It hisses politely, a sound as reliable as church bells. And elsewhere in the mansion, another servant, with an altogether noisier burden, has just begun her own tasks inside the manor's most fragrant, peculiar domain. As the thick fog lifted ever so slightly from the grey slates of the servants' wing rooftops, the sun yawned into the cold drawing-room windows, where the silver had already been polished into submission, and the fireplace swept like stage curtains before a matinee. It was time for the all-important ritual that few discuss and fewer remember. The mid-morning shoe shine round, known among butlers with a sense of drama as the parade of souls. Shoes, you see, were no laughing matter in the Victorian household. Though they rarely made conversational appearances in the diaries of lords or the letters of duchesses, below the staircase there existed an entire ecosystem of shoe-related responsibility. The freshly polished leather toe of Sir Eustace's walking boots could reflect his marriageability, his moral fibre, and, most alarmingly to the valet, what he'd stepped in during his early walk in the garden. Enter the shoe boy. Not a boy in any real sense, because employment laws were jumbled at best, and youth was a flexible concept depending on whether you were licking envelopes or scrubbing the insoles of a marquess. The shoe boy was typically a lad, or possibly just a small, fast-moving adult, tasked with gathering the family's footwear from outside their doors shining each one to a gleam indistinguishable from freshly poured treacle, and delivering them back before Lady Hortensia noticed her riding boots were 5 minutes late. He operated in stealth, like a particularly well-behaved cat burglar. Shoes were collected in a lined basket, always in matching pairs, unless one had mysteriously travelled during the night, something no one would admit to, but the staff knew a sleepwalking baronet when they saw one. The polishing was done downstairs in a nook of the scullery referred to in hushed tones as the shine chamber. It was not, contrary to rumour, a torture room, unless you count the psychological effects of buffing 40 pairs of brogues before the second bell had rung. The walls were lined with brushes, the stiff bristles for removing mud, the soft goat hair ones for the final sheen, and one particularly fluffy brush reserved exclusively for Lady Margaret's dancing slippers. The most prized tool, however, was the homemade polish itself, a bubbling concoction of beeswax, soot, lanolin, and God knows what else. Mrs. Tibble, the cook, swore there was plum jam in the mixture. She might have been jesting. Then again, her idea of a joke once involved placing a trout in the footman's hat. No one was sure where to draw the line with her. Once the shoes were polished to a degree acceptable for being seen by both humans and ornamental dogs, they were delivered back upstairs. The perilous return journey, known among senior staff as the staircase ascent, required balance, memory, and the ability to dodge the occasional unexpectedly opening door. Dropping a countess's court shoes into a coal scuttle was a sacking offence. At the very least, it meant no crumpets for a week. But here's the real marvel. The members of the household believed, without question, that their shoes gleamed each morning because of some combination of divine intervention and good breeding. The idea that an actual person had been up since dawn, brushing gunk off their heels, did not register. The silence of a well-oiled schedule was, to upper society, as invisible as the breeze that moved their curtains. Yet the shoeboy wasn't alone in his polishy pursuits. The housekeeper would pass en route to checking linens, casting a shrewd eye over a patent leather toe with a disapproving sniff of one who once dined alongside Queen Victoria's under-butler. Footmen might saunter past whistling a tune composed entirely of knowing scoffs, unless they needed their own livery boots done, in which case their deference would rival a man proposing marriage on his knees. And then, just before 11 o'clock, the glass bell over the breakfast tray would shimmer lightly. The house would flutter with signs of movement. Doors opened, timidly at first, and out stepped the gentry, fully shoed and blissfully unaware that their elevated moral standing rested, quite literally, on a layer of wax and 2 hours of unpaid labour. By this point, the shoeboy, who we may now call Edgar, for such was his name, would be curled behind the scullery stove, his fingertips blackened and his eyes half-lidded. He'd earned precisely 30 minutes of rest before someone realised the Turkish slippers had gone missing again, likely under the piano, or mysteriously worn by the corgi. Let us leave Edgar there for now, dozing by the fire as the house breathes in its polished morning. After all, the bells have only just begun hinting at the next round of chaos, when porcelain meets porridge and buttered scones collide with embroidered tablecloths. By the time the clock struck the very gentlemanly hour of 7 a.m., a time when the upper classes were just beginning to consider the philosophical question of whether to uncurl from their Egyptian cotton sheets. Downstairs in the scullery, the air was already humming with the sounds of the Victorian domestic orchestra. A rattling kettle, a groaning mangle, the scrape of irons on hearthstones, and the delicate art of tiptoeing around creaky floorboards that had betrayed many a servant's attempt at silent heroism. And speaking of tiptoeing, it was around this time that the footman, who we can only assume had applied enough pomade to sculpt a wax museum, would begin his morning duties with the solemn dignity of someone about to perform a Shakespearean monologue. His first mission, polishing the silver, or more precisely, engaging in gladiatorial combat with a tarnish that had self-assembled overnight, like a tiny army of gremlins with a vendetta against reflective surfaces. Polishing the silver wasn't just a task, it was a meditation. Handle, buff, inspect. Handle, buff, inspect. Soothing in its own strange, mind-numbing way, like polishing spoons in a cathedral of quiet misery. Of course, it helped to imagine you're preparing the cutlery not for breakfast eggs, but for a diplomatic banquet attended by Queen Victoria herself, who may or may not have once declared a certain fork impressively lustrous. Records are unclear, but if you're half asleep, let's assume she did. Meanwhile, upstairs, the housemaid was conducting one of the most delicate acts of the Victorian morning ballet, fireplace maintenance in the master bedroom. Armed with yesterday's ashes and a coal box that could double as a small anvil, she shuffled across plush carpet soundlessly, as though levitating. Making noise while refueling a fire was the domestic equivalent of setting off a cannon in a monastery. One clink and you were banished, though only metaphorically. In truth, you might just be subjected to a disapproval so icy it could chill your petticoats. Lighting a fire in the master's chamber required not only stealth, but the patient brain of a pyromancer. First, craft your fuel pyramid with twists of newspaper and kindling, like origami for arsonists. Then strike a match, not too fast, for that would jar the silence. Not too slow, or it would sputter and die a tragic smoky death. A middle-speed match strike, a Goldilocks of combustion. Once the fire took, the housemaid had a brief window of enchantment, a flickering hearth, a rising warmth, the dancing shadows casting antique silhouettes on the wall. For perhaps 15 seconds, the world was quiet, and she could pretend she lived here, that the soft, rose-colored upholstery wasn't hers to dust, but to recline upon. And then, carriage wheels clattered outside, the mistress rang for her tea, and just like that, back to professional invisibility. Elsewhere in the kitchen, the cook was orchestrating a gentle chaos. A Victorian breakfast was less a meal and more of a culinary victory parade. Kippers reeking magnificently of the sea, soft-boiled eggs lined in perfect formation, grilled kidneys, which seemed like a cruel joke of anatomy, all rising like a puff of glory beneath the dome platters that would eventually be paraded upstairs like silver UFOs filled with cholesterol. Of course, none of this could proceed without the youngest of the scullery maids, sometimes just 12 or 13 years old, thrust into the trenches of jug duty. Hot water had to be ferried up to bedrooms for washing, and unless you fancied a wake-up call involving coal splash and an involuntary scream, you'd better ensure the water was neither too tepid nor too scalding. A scullery maid learned early that hot water was gold, and jugs were sacred vessels. Drop one, and you might as well flee to the colonies. The laundry maid, incidentally, wouldn't even see the house until later. She remained deep in the underworld of suds and shirt cuffs, keeping time by linen alone. She worked with a rhythm you could set your pocket watch to: scrub, wring, rinse, repeat, while dreaming of a world in which clothes washed themselves and underclothes were only worn on Tuesdays. And let us not forget the butler, guardian of manners and vintages, who by now had descended into the wine cellar, ostensibly to inspect the sherry, but possibly also to enjoy 7 quiet minutes with nobody asking him about folded napkins. Butlers were in many ways the submarine captains of the household, invisible until needed, and always plotting the efficient use of port. And so, as another breakfast rose from the underbellies of the Victorian home, complete with toast, you could roof a garden shed with, and marmalade that could glue an envelope, the day truly began. Not for the first time, but the third. And not for the house, but for the masters. Because in the hierarchy of dawn, servants always arrived first, and most often with ash on their aprons. Now, follow the coal smoke and gentle clatter, and let us drift ever so quietly toward the intriguing world of how one got dressed, with help, of course. In the age of 5-button boots and corsets, you needed an instruction manual to open. By the time the haze of Victorian morning had begun lifting from drizzly windows and coal-scented air, the servants were well into what one might call their second wind, though the first may have escaped unnoticed somewhere between blacking the boots and dodging the chamber pot. Among all the critical duties left in the flurry of pre-breakfast busyness, none loomed larger, symbolically or aromatically, than the firing of the dining room hearth. Now, you may be tempted to imagine this as a simple, cozy task. One logs on gently, sparks a cheerful crackle, and voila, warmth and ambience completed before the lady of the house had completed her first inaudible sigh of daybreak disapproval. But alas, things were rarely so poetic in the Georgian revival homes of upper middle London. Lighting a Victorian-era fire was closer to warfare than romantic reverie, and the foot soldier of choice was a harried servant in a soot-streaked apron with a box of matches and dwindling optimism. Picture, if you will, the under-parlour maid, Polly, our hypothetical heroine with sinewy arms, an instinct for creaky floorboard diplomacy, and lungs accustomed to the ancestral practice of coal coughing. Her task, to ignite the breakfast hour blaze in time for the master's coffee and the mistress's subtle but world-ending side-eye. But there was a problem. The wood was damp. The coal had been stored near onions, a known but oft-ignored error, and Polly's only kindling was yesterday's crumpled Times, which, while politically incendiary, lacked the spark of actual flame. She struck the match. Nothing. Struck it again. A feeble fizz. The fire stubbornly refused to be fired. All while, above stairs, the bell for the dining room gave a single accusing jingle. Timing, as it goes, is everything in both comedy and domestic service, and both generally occur without thanks. In moments like these, Polly may have turned to an old Victorian trick, the use of blazing pastilles, small chemical wonderpucks of sawdust, paraffin wax and ambition, which when lit offered an almost magical burst of combustibility. Of course, they also filled the room with an aroma best described as marzipan despair, and were banned in some homes on account of their tendency to jump into curtains. Another solution? Alcohol. No, not to drink, although understandably tempting at this point, but as a fire starter. Brandy-soaked rags could be used in extremis, assuming one could appropriate a splash from the butler's carefully inventoried drinks cabinet and not ignite the drapes in the process. It was a thin line, truly, between triumphant flame and domestic arson. At a certain point, Polly would give in to fate, abandon the scorched Times and the traitorous cinders, and go for the foolproof method, begging the kitchen maid to lend her a coal from the range fire, balanced precariously on an iron scoop, transported like a holy relic through the eerily silent hallway. Once finally set, the fire offered exactly the kind of agreeable crackle that made guests think the household simply woke up like this. Effortlessly warm, perfectly poised, and lightly scented with toasted crumpet fantasies. They didn't see the hours of scrubbing black lead off one's hands, or the quiet cursing when the poker slipped and knocked last autumn's soot right into someone's bangless eyes. As the coal settled and the room heated inch by inch, Polly would take a moment, precisely one moment, to glance out the antique window at the grey blur of cobbled London, wondering what it might be like to rise at 9, have bread already buttered, and find the fire politely roaring without ever having glanced at newspaper ashes or heard the humiliating pleck of a failed match. But then came the sounds. A teaspoon tinkling in the distance, the impatient shuffle of morning boots upstairs, the unmistakable rustle of breakfast being set. Polly sniffed her soot-blackened fingers, wiped them vaguely on an apron already bearing the day's itinerary, and turned back to her duties. The next task waited, quiet and utterly predictable. Plump the dining room chairs, polish the sugar tongs, and ensure the fruit bowl contained no less than one exotic item, preferably a bruised pineapple or baffling waxen fig. And so the morning pressed on, like a well-starched cravat, tight, tidy, and unyielding. But somewhere between the precision-folded napkins and the soft hiss of boiling water, there lingered the promise of something softer, more secretive, perhaps even a touch of mischief, hidden in the folds of downstairs routine. Let's peek there next, behind the pantry door, into the quiet rituals no dinner guest would ever dream of discovering, as the gaslights flickered out across the great drawing rooms of Victorian England and the silver trays were polished to a quiet gleam. Our tale begins to draw its final breath, much like the parlourmaid leaning groggily against the scullery door at 10:30. The house is asleep, or at least the important parts of it believe they are. But beneath the herringbone floorboards and petticoated hush of upper-class dreams, the servants are finally beginning to rest. They've survived another morning. And what a morning it was. By now, the coals are banked and the servants' hall smells faintly of candle wax, dishwater, and the singular aroma of well-cooked cabbage that somehow managed to quietly permeate every stately home within a 20-mile radius. The boot boy is softly snoring beside a stack of polished shoes, his head resting perilously close to someone's left boot of a size and smell unsuitable for the faint of heart. He's dreaming, perhaps of rags that shine themselves, or a chimney that sweeps backwards. The scullery maid has finally finished her 100th dish and sits in a small chair that creaks with the weight of exhaustion, more than her own tiny frame. She stares at the last spoon in the drying rack as though it might sprout legs and gallop away like in her brother's bedtime stories. Perhaps she will name it. Perhaps it already has a name. Geoffrey. That feels like the kind of name a single polished tablespoon might acquire after 14 hours of unpaid overtime. Above them, the house sleeps peacefully beneath its blanket of stillness and class divide. Lady Abigail, unaware that her breakfast had been slightly burnt and then surgically replaced by the kitchen maid's best impersonation of divine intervention, dreams of silk gloves and stolen glances. Lord Harrington is blissfully unaware that his prized hat was earlier taken for a test twirl by a cheeky footman with theatrical aspirations. It was returned, but it now smells faintly of lavender pomade and ambition. Throughout this long day, or rather, an unusually elongated morning cleverly disguised as a single sunrise, each servant has played their part in a spectacular performance that the household shall never truly see. There was Mr. Pritchard, the butler, who moved like a gentleman-shaped ghost, polishing the master's wine glasses using precisely 3 clockwise motions. Any more, he said, and the ghosts of vintages past might be summoned. He said it often, and with such conviction, that no one quite dared to test the theory. And there was little Beatrice in the laundry room, who claimed she could identify any member of the household by sniffing their handkerchiefs. A haunting skill, but dreadfully useful at parties. Even the kitchen range, affectionately named Bertha, has given her all today, belching out reluctant heat while protesting in Victorian stove dialect, a great deal of hollow clanks and spontaneous sighs. There was a marmalade incident at dawn. We don't talk about it, but rest assured, the marmalade was avenged. And now, as the grandmother clock strikes midnight on this long day's morning, the house exhales its final yawning breath. The servants disappear into their narrow beds, rolling into dreams pressed between ironed linens and the rustle of last week's gossip. Their dreams are simple. Perhaps of a cup of tea they didn't have to serve, or shoes that walked themselves back into the closet. The house won't stir again until the first lazy glow of dawn creeps along the lace curtains and the cockerel, who lives somewhere inconveniently near the footman's quarters, utters his spiteful morning screech. Then the servants will rise once more, before the sun, before the eggs, before anyone with a title starts pondering their toast. But for now, for now, they rest. The kind of rest earned honestly, humbly, and with a faint whiff of coal dust behind the ears. So let us leave them here, tucked in beneath the sagging beams and sighs of history. The boots lined up like straight-back soldiers, the spoons resting in their neat silvery prison, and little Beatrice whispering in her sleep about a scandal beneath the laundry heap. Everything is quiet now, and so should you be. Let your mind drift like steam from a teacup, curling through corridors long vanished. Settle back into the mattress and close your eyes. The morning routines of Victorian servants are finally at rest, and so are you. Sleep well.